Hey everybody, I thought I would share some thoughts that might be useful to you as both sort of students and scholars of the Old Testament, but then also as people who read this for ministry purposes. And with much of what I do, I'll try to gear it for something that's not just academic as an end in and of itself, but as something that might be useful to you in your ministry. And so I thought a thoughtful way to start might be dealing with what is the Old Testament and how should we use it. I'm often discouraged by the way people use the Old Testament, where it's almost like looking in a mirror. They can sort of find whatever they want and use it however they want. And I don't think that is being good stewards of the text. And I don't think that's how God would want us to use the text. So anyway, just some thoughtful things that could be useful in a Bible study situation scenario at your church or in your ministry, and even just food for thought for yourself today. So, what is the Bible and how we should use it is a question I'm trying to look at here. What's the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament? And, this is one I often like to do with the youth. Well, not often, but I have posed this youth before. Famous verse, right? Exodus chapter 20, one of the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. One thing you can ask a group of folks with a passage like this is, how many of you like the Ten Commandments? Some people are discouraged that the Ten Commandments are no longer allowed in certain public places, or the Ten Commandments are a good guide to our life. Anyway, it's not difficult to find value in the Ten Commandments, especially within a church setting. And then you can ask the question, how many of you think we should keep the Ten Commandments? Well, and here's commandment number 4. Number 4, the Sabbath's for our worship and for rest. That's the song I learned. Anywho, what day is the Sabbath? Right? I mean, according to this, resting on the last day is a big deal, right? Because God worked for 6 days and he rested on the seventh. And it's for this reason that we too should rest on the seventh. We should remember. We should keep the Sabbath day. But we don't. None of us do. And so that's good food for thought. Why is it that none of us, every week, and some of us professionally, we flagrantly disobey commandment number 4? So how do we use the Old Testament? One of the commandments we seem to not even keep. So what do you do with that? That's a good question. Or here's another question, or another passage. Jeremiah 29:11. It's a very famous passage. Maybe some of you saw the Babylon Bee that came out recently, and they said an ancient copy of Jeremiah was found, and the entire book was actually just Jeremiah 29:11, which is because that seems to be the only verse people know of Jeremiah. Anyway, not to diminish or make light of the passage, because it's a very powerful passage, especially if you know the context for Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in the future. And you could ask the question, what does this passage mean? And people will often point to a God who cares for us and loves us and seeks our good. And that's great. And I don't disagree with that. I do believe in an amazing and loving God. And this verse definitely gets at that for sure. At the same time, though, however, what do you do with passages like this one from Amos? Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. Why do you long for the day of the Lord? That day will be darkness, not light. It will be as though a man fled from a lion only to meet a bear, as though he entered his house and rested his hand on the wall only to have a snake bite him, because their houses were made out of dirt and clay. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness, not light, pitch dark, without a ray of brightness? Now, when you juxtapose this passage with the Jeremiah one, it makes you want to ask, well, who's this one for? This one. That other one I'm pretty sure was for me. This one here, maybe the terrorists, maybe the political party I don't like. I don't know. Bad guys. This one's for bad guys. I'm a good guy. The other one's for me. Right? And how do you know that? How do you know the other one is for you and this one isn't? And it really begs the question, why do we use the Bible the way that we do? And what's the most responsible way for us to use the Bible? And I think for many people, when it comes to the Old Testament, which is ancient and, well, more ancient than the New Testament, and it often feels foreign and confusing, and they don't always like how God's portrayed. The Old Testament, using the Old Testament, that becomes a confusing question that they're just not really comfortable answering. And or before we resolve the tension, here's another one. You've got this covenant ceremony with Abraham, and maybe I will skip down to verse 12 here, Genesis 15:12. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. I skipped verse 10. Verse 10. Then he brought all of these to him and cut them in two, and laid each half opposite the other, but did not cut the birds. Okay, so animals are cut in two, right? They're severed into two halves, and they're separated upon the ground. And not the birds, though, maybe because the birds are too small. And then God, using the language of smoke and fire, which the Old Testament often does to describe a theophany or appearance of God, God passes through these pieces. What on earth is going on? Like, if you don't know anything about the Old Testament or the historical context, this is really weird, right? And so what do you do with that? So critical thinking, you should know what you know and know how you know it. This is something I often repeat in the classes I've taught over the years. Being able to boil things down to their most basic elements is a very good thing to do. Why do you believe what you believe? What do you know about the Bible, about the Old Testament? How much in terms of your theology? What basis do you have for your beliefs? When it comes to the Old Testament, how do you use the Old Testament? What's the purpose of the Old Testament? And of course, there's lots of hermeneutical rules and guidelines a person can come up with. But to keep it very simple, which in the church, I think it is good to keep it simple. And, to be fair, Jesus kept it very simple, although simple things are often complex as well. Long story short, in my mind, the best way to read the Old Testament is to learn of God's character, to learn who He is. As finite creatures, we spend our lives seeking to understand an infinite Creator. And that's often difficult and mysterious and challenging. But we walk down this road seeking understanding, and that we don't complete that journey in this world, we complete it in the next. And so looking at the Amos passage and the Jeremiah passage and the Genesis passage, in all of these I would seek to look for God's character. And in all three of these passages, we learn a great deal about who God is. And that allows us, that sort of gives us better guidance in our worship of God, in our understanding of God, in our teaching of the things of God. So anyway, that's just food for thought. These passages could be useful as you seek to maybe challenge or work with some folks who don't know much about the Old Testament, but could use some food for thought. Okay, have a great day.